Hello, welcome to your 2025 Standards Update from BookNet, the go-to supply chain organization for book standards, updates, and related professional development content in the Canadian book industry. Before I continue, I would like to acknowledge that BookNet Canada's operations are remote and that my colleagues and I contribute our work from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wyandot, the Mi'kmaq, the Ojibwa of Fort William First Nation, the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and the Métis, the original nations and peoples of the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, Thunder Bay, Toronto, Vaughan, and Windsor. We encourage you to visit the native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are listening from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space-making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities in all that complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. Last year's update was focused on BISAC. The content from that presentation is as important today as it was back in 2024. In it, we shared information on the additions and changes made to the BISAC list in 2023, which are particularly important to publishers of Indigenous content. You can find the recording of that session on the metadata section of the TechForum website. Now, in this presentation, we will expand our horizons to take a stock of what's new or changed in 2024, as well as during the first months of 2025 in the standards world. To start, let's talk about ONIX. ONIX, the international standard for representing and communicating book industry product information, also known as metadata, in electronic form, is constantly evolving to meet the needs of the book supply chain. During the next few minutes, I will walk you through some of the most significant updates and changes made to the ONIX codelist in releases 64 to 69. However, I strongly recommend reviewing EDItEUR's detailed release notes, which can be found on their website or on the BookNet blog, where for each codelist release, we share key highlights relevant to the Canadian book supply chain. In early 2024, EDItEUR, the organization that develops and maintains this standard, released ONIX Codelist 64, which includes updates related to List 9, Product Classification Type, List 17, Contributor Role, List 196, e-publication accessibility details. Updates to this list include clarifications to Code 00 Accessibility Summary and 52 All non-decorative content supports reading without sight, plus some other additions worth reviewing, especially by anyone aiming to comply with the European Accessibility Act. But don't worry, we'll talk more about this regulation later in the presentation. Later on, in March, Codelist 65 was released. Some changes of particular note include the addition of new codes to List 17, Contributor Role, to reflect considerations expressed in the late Dr. Gregory Youngin's Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples. The codes are 828, interpreted through, which should be used with narratives drawn from an oral tradition where no ownership of the narrative is claimed, and Code B33, transcribed by, or as told to, which should be used with narratives drawn from an oral tradition and with B03 retold by, B07 as told by, or A28 interpreted through. These additions happen as a result of advocacy by BookNet and were endorsed by the Canadian National Bibliographic Committee. And if you're interested in learning more about Dr. Gregory Younging's work, I encourage you to watch the recording from one of our recent Tech Forum presentations all about the second edition of his book, Elements of Indigenous Style. In July, Codelist 66 was published. In this release, there were additions made to List 17, Contributor Role, specifically the addition of Code B34 for sensitivity reader/editor, which is expected to reflect a reader or editor responsible for ensuring the text is free of offensive, potentially offensive, or insensitive language, is inclusive and free from bias, and avoids stereotypical characterization. List 79, Product Form Feature Type, had some significant additions, especially relevant to those who are looking to comply with the EU Deforestation Regulations, EUDR. The codes added are Code 50, EUDR Due Diligence Reference, Code 47, EUDR Raw Material Location, Interior or Full Product, Code 48, EUDR Raw Material Location, Binding, Code 49, EUDR Raw Material Location, Other. We'll share additional resources related to the EUDR and other regulations later on, but we highly encourage you to read the documents summarizing the changes made to this code list available on the EDItEUR website and the BookNet blog. Other changes made to this particular list include the addition of codes related to product safety and updates made to codes part of the List 175 Product Form Detail. Closing the year in November, Code List 67 was released. The following list saw some changes. List 17, Contributor Role, List 71, Sales Restriction Type, List 79, Product Form Feature Type, which includes some clarifying edits made to the EUDR-related codes, List 198, Product Content Type, and List 239, Supply Contact Role, List 158, Resource Content Type, and finally, List 203, ONIX Adult Audience Rating. In January 2025, Codelist 68 was released. The following list saw some changes and additions. List 17, Contributor Role, now includes code B35 to reflect the role of image descriptions by, which EDItEUR defines as the creator of alternative image descriptions for accessibility purposes. List 73, Website Role, now includes code 52 to reflect the type of website for publishers or third-party contact form, for which EDItEUR gives an example of a web page providing an interactive contact form for safety-related issues. Publishers and data centers interested in supporting the EU's General Product Safety Regulation will find value in this new code addition. The additions made to List 74 language continue the expansion of this list with Codelist 63's numerous additions to include several publishing languages used by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in the lands we now call Canada. In this release, code OCA for the Inseltian language was added. List 79, Product Form Feature Type, now includes code 54, which allows data centers to share an EDItEUR stock present attestation, which serves as a confirmation that all stock provided to suppliers in the EU predates the publisher's appropriate EUDR deadline. As a reminder, the deadline for compliance is December 30th, 2025, or June 30th, 2026 for micro and small enterprises. This replaces the need for a due diligence statement or DDS, but not the obligation to provide documentation if requested. Of note, any subsequent stock would require submissions of a DDS, which will include an equivalent statement, making this code redundant. So it's a good practice to remove this value when DDS information is added. Finally, List 262 Carbon/GHG Emission Certification Scheme. The new addition to this list has a Canadian connection. It follows the launch of two free-to-use sustainable publishing tools. Carbon calculators designed specifically for publishing industry professionals that emerge from a collaboration between New Society Publishers and ECW Press, with funding from the Canada Council for the Arts through the Digital Greenhouse Grant to reflect per book carbon calculations measured through the sustainable publishing tools. Data centers should use code 202. If you're interested in learning more about the sustainable publishing tools, I encourage you to check out the link on the accompanying resources page for information on how to access the tools and a training video. More recently, in February, EDItEUR released ONIX codelist 69. This update impacted multiple lists, including List 17, Contributor Role, List 45, Publishing Role, List 73, Website Role, and more. Of note for this release, codes 12 and 13 to 17 of the List 27 Subject Scheme Identifier have been deprecated and will be dropped from this code list as part of a future version change. These codes relate to the BIC subject standard, which has been replaced by Thema and was declared obsolete by BIC as of February 2024. Now, as mentioned at a recent Tech Forum session on the rights book subjects on the move in the Canadian market, where my colleagues Lily Dwyer and Kalpna Patel shared how special edition books are all the rage. As this trend firmly entrenches itself into production workflows, EDItEUR has added codes and cleaned up the notes for others. To dive deeper into this, we recommend focusing on the additions made to List 79, Product Form Feature Type, List 158, Resource Content Type, List 175, Product Form Detail, as well as List 258, Special Finish. EU regulations continue to be at the forefront of the standards work developed by EDItEUR. For List 79 EU regulations, for example, Code 13 GPSR description has changed to reflect correct naming as well as a note clarification for EU General Product Safety Regulation and Toy Safety Directive hazard warning. Similarly, clarifications were added in the instructions of Code 47 EUDR raw material locations, which affects codes 48 and 49, and in the instructions of Code 51 EUDR due diligence. Finally, for List 196 e-publication accessibility details, clarifying edits were made to the notes for existing Code 28 for full alternative audio descriptions, as well as 31 to indicate accessible controls provided. New codes were added as well. Code 41 will indicate page list navigation to flag that an ebook includes page number navigation based on print equivalent page numbers, or digital-only static page breaks. Code 53 will indicate described math content to indicate a book contains textual description of mathematical content, either as an alternative description attached to an image of the content or in addition to MathML or LaTeX. Meanwhile, Code 54 will indicate accessible chemistry content as LaTeX. If you are wondering why there seems to be repetition in the updates and changes made across codeless releases, It helps to keep in mind that EDItEUR and its partners work on continuously improving ONIX to better serve the supply chain. This sometimes translates into small, continuous additions and changes. For this reason, we encourage you to first keep an eye on our blog for future codelist releases, and second, read the detailed notes EDItEUR provides with each release. That said, the codelist releases are not all that is new for ONIX. During this already busy time, the EDItEUR team released ONIX 3.1.1 in March and ONIX 3.1.2 in November. Here's the snippet from the EDItEUR document summarizing the changes and additions made in ONIX 3.1.1. This revision comes only 12 months after the publication of Release 3.1. EDItEUR normally aims for a 2-year cadence to revisions of ONIX, but in this instance, the new functionality was requested by a group of ONIX users and national groups to meet an urgent need to express an EU text and data mining, or TDM, opt-out on marketing collateral. And here's a snippet from the EDItEUR document summarizing the changes and additions made in ONIX 3.1.2. This is a very minor update of ONIX 3.1, with the addition of a single new field, postal code, or X590. In turn, and alongside some existing fields, this enables the inclusion of full postal addresses within product contact and supply contact, enabling publishers and others to supply retailers with postal addresses related to product safety. This is a requirement for the upcoming EU General Product Safety Regulation. GPSR applies to essentially all consumer products. The only other changes in 3.1.2 are an increase in suggested maximum length of the text in product form feature description to allow longer list of GPS coordinates for EUDR, and the addition of the new postal code tag in event occurrence, because all the other elements of a street address were already present there. The release of ONIX 3.1.2 follows a series of edits and inclusions to the ONIX codelist over the past several years. Our team at BookNet acknowledges the dedication of the EDItEUR team in Graham Bell and Chris Sainer for their work to stay on top of an ever-evolving regulatory environment coming out of the EU, coordinating feedback from a global ONIX user base in order to support global trade, and sustaining an aggressive series of releases. The ONIX 3.1 specification, the implementation and best practice guide, and various schema files available from EDItEUR have been updated and are available for download on the EDItEUR website. To make things easier, we have shared all those resources mentioned in this presentation in a document which can be accessed on the Tech Forum website. As you hopefully know by now, we are big fans of the work EDItEUR does. To expand the reach of the resources they create, we share bits and pieces, mostly from ONIX application notes, on our blog series, Advice Worth Reading from EDItEUR. These notes are short white papers that look in depth at a single ONIX topic that users are asking about or that EDItEUR is aware can be problematic. They are intended to support their very detailed and extremely well-organized documentation. The subject of the first applications notes document we highlighted in 2024 is ONIX records for books in multiple markets. In the notes, EDItEUR shares context as to why this seemingly straightforward endeavor may end up being quite complicated to tackle when, for example, instead of the originating publisher, Another publisher or a sales agent is appointed to take responsibility for the product in a particular market. This is a very common case, and revenue relevant contradictions and confusion can arise when there are two ONIX records for the same product that have not been aligned. This application note also covers another common case where two publishers are producing similar products and similar metadata independently of each other. For example, when publishing rights are split on geographical lines. The application notes are thorough and designed to leave you with more answers than questions. But if you're short on time or only need a quick refresher, the editor team includes a summary at the end where they give you all the key information in a TLDR format. As mentioned earlier, the application notes are created to answer common questions or tackle particularly complex topics. For example, accessibility metadata. It is known that ONIX has been a key tool to help communicate accessibility information about a book. But these days, thanks to the soon to be enforced regulation coming from the European Union, publishers are paying even more attention to this piece of metadata. Remember that earlier, when talking about the release of Codelist 64, I mentioned the European Accessibility Act? If you are a publisher who sells or is planning on selling digital books, ebooks, or audiobooks in the European Union, starting June 28th, you will be asked to comply with this new regulation. Now, regulation aside, publishers, even those who do not sell their books in the European market, should aim to make their books as accessible as possible. And this includes providing accurate and complete accessibility metadata. To help with this, EDItEUR created the Providing Accessibility Metadata in ONIX application note, an advanced document that supplements the existing application note accessibility metadata in ONIX, which is the recommended starting point for anyone looking to learn more about this subject. In the advanced note, EDItEUR starts by answering why accessibility metadata is important in ONIX. Then they highlight the relevant code list and later on dive deep into accessibility metadata for physical publications, Braille and tactile titles, large print titles, adapted titles, as well as digital publications. But this is not all. They also talk about Thema and accessibility, provide tips on how to keep accessibility metadata up to date, and share examples of the potential applications of the code list, including suggestions for the mapping to schema.org. This document is a must read for anyone creating or distributing metadata, whether you are just starting to consider including accessibility metadata or you want to see if there's anything that has changed or improved since the last time you reviewed your workflows. Another EU regulation that is shaking the book industry is the General Product Safety Regulation, or GPSR, which came into effect on December 13, 2024. These rules compel anyone selling products into the European Economic Area, which includes the 27 countries of the EU plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. The GPSR mandates that nearly every product, even those one will generally consider to be safe, such as books, must adhere to the regulation if that product is to be sold in the European Economic Area. To help publishers and data centers determine how information related to this and other safety regulations can be communicated in the supply chain, EDItEUR released the Product Safety Requirements in ONIX 3 application note. One important note from the EDItEUR team highlights that regulations linked to safety and security are often updated, and they vary between countries. So, publishers and distributors should always check on the current regulations specific to the jurisdictions in which they operate. They also said If there are aspects of regulations for safety that need to be conveyed in an ONIX file that you cannot find in the current code list, please contact EDItEUR. As you can see, a lot of the changes and additions made to ONIX have been driven by the need to comply with the new regulations. In addition to what we have already shared, we have a series of resources created by us and other organizations that will help you understand the scope of these regulations and figure out the next steps towards compliance. The first is a webinar where Chris Steiner and Wendy Reed guide Canadian publishers through the essentials of the EAA. They talk about the role of metadata and ONIX in compliance. They explore key accessibility standards and resources developed by the W3C. And they share how Kobo is preparing to align with the EAA. You can find the recording, slides, transcript, and a list of key resources mentioned in this presentation on the Tech Forum website. Then, for a deeper dive, we recommend watching the recordings from the webinar series all about the EAA hosted by our UK sister organization, Book Industry Communication. In this series, they explore topics such as fixed layout, alt text for digital books, EPUB and PDF, and metadata. And if you want even more content related to accessibility that also touches on the EAA, we recommend listening to our podcast interview with Wendy about the work the W3C has been doing. As for the EUDR, back in September, we co-hosted with the Book Industry Study Group the EUDR and ONIX webinar led by Graham Bell. In this webinar, Graham discusses the impact of the EUDR, the responsibilities it places on publishers, distributors, and retailers, both within and outside the European Union, and the need for data collection and record keeping about the sources of raw materials used in the book industry. He also describes how ONIX is used to communicate some of the key metadata required for compliance with the regulations. Additionally, back in December, we invited Simon Crump, environmental consultant for BIC, to our podcast to discuss this regulation and its impact on the book industry. In this conversation, Simon offers insights on how the EUDR affects the book supply chain, practical steps for Canadian publishers to align with the regulation, as well as resources for non-European publishers aiming to understand compliance requirements. Another way to learn even more about the EUDR is by exploring the content on the BIC's Green Hub, where they share updates and resources related to this particular legislation. Now, shifting gears to the GPSR, you can learn more about this regulation on the BIC website. We recommend reading the white paper BIC Bites Introduction to General Product Safety Regulations. And we also recommend watching the recording of European directives, ONIX, and the importance of metadata in the international book supply chain, a webinar hosted by BISG, where Chris Steiner provided an overview of the 3 European directives. Let's talk about Thema. At BookNet, we are big fans of Thema. We recommend that Canadian data standards and receivers support both BISAC subject headings as well as Thema subject categories to fulsomely represent book products for sale in Canada. Back in October 2024, EDItEUR released Thema version 1.6. This version contains 131 new subject categories and 411 new qualifiers. As with all previous Thema updates, this is an additions-only update, meaning that all versions of Thema remain fully backward compatible with their predecessors, and no existing category has changed its meaning, though there are some minor updates to the exact wording to improve clarity and aid in translation. Some of the key additions include: first, qualifiers for the literature of a particular place. This refers to groupings of books that are part of the culture of a place and related to the setting of a story, the nationality of the author, and the country of publication. It also includes new qualifiers to highlight books about or in support of individual UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as well as expansion of the range of popular fiction genre categories, particularly within romance. And finally, greater geographical coverage of Ukraine, Australia, and Canada. To celebrate the release of Thema version 1.6, our Tech Forum team hosted a webinar with Chris Sainer of EDItEUR and Isabel Godelavine of BTLF to share updates to Thema and their applications to the Canadian market. As with all things Tech Forum, the recording and resources can be found on the bnctechforum.ca website. Our love for Thema doesn't end there. We continue to share real-life examples of the use of Thema in our Using Thema to Identify Diverse Content in Product Metadata blog series, where we illustrate how Thema can complement BISAC while improving not only discoverability, but also subject classification accuracy. In addition to all this, we continue to support and maintain the BISAC to Thema translator, which makes use of mapping to give publishers an easy way to translate the BISAC codes they already use into Thema codes that they should be using. After all, BISAC and Thema are actually complementary subject systems that are stronger together for the North American market, compared to using just one subject coding system over the other. By now, you may be wondering, what about BISAC? As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the 2023 updates made to BISAC are particularly important to publishers of Indigenous content. If you're not familiar with these yet, we have a written resource as well as a presentation summarizing key changes and additions. More recently, BISG released the 2024 update. To learn about the changes for this list, as well as the process used to create the update, we encourage you to watch this BISG webinar. When it comes to the 2024 updates, there are a number of notable contributions from the Canadian market participants. For example, the BISG Subject Codes Committee has added a code for non-binary and genderqueer under the following subject branches: comics and graphic novels LGBTQ+, fiction erotica LGBTQ+, fiction LGBTQ+, fiction romance LGBTQ+, social science LGBTQ+ studies, young adult fiction LGBTQ+, young adult nonfiction LGBTQ+, juvenile fiction LGBTQ+, juvenile nonfiction LGBTQ+. The last three are branches newly created. I also would like to mention that this work is thanks to an initial request by Jamie Ferrin at Penguin Random House Canada and was endorsed by the Canadian National Bibliographic Committee. Another major set of addition is largely thanks to Blake Sproul and the team at Playwrights Canada Press, who drove the proposal list to the BISG Subject Codes Committee for the subject editions under the drama subject tree. There are over 20 changes to the drama section, including new codes for adaptations, monologues, and scenes, and a robust branch for subjects and themes. Additional notable changes for the 2024 edition is a major reorganization of art subjects and a renaming of the foreign language study tree to the more neutral and respectful language study. To understand the breadth of the changes, please refer to the BookNet's blog on the topic. And last but not least, let's talk about the International Standard Name Identifier, also known as ISNI. As you may know, we are longtime advocates of the use of ISNI. In fact, back in August, we shared on the blog an overview of our current understanding of where the Canadian industry is on this important topic. We also highlighted a document where ISNI, the organization, shares a list of benefits for publishers that come from using this identifier. Some of them include global identification of contributors across multiple systems, a single identifier for all entities from the public names of contributors to fictional characters, and publishers' imprints to data aggregators, cross media marketing, and data enrichment, as well as interoperability. However, it remains that obtaining an ISNI was challenging for English market participants in Canada, formerly served by the British Library, who were not able to access ISNI registration services as the library recovered from a cyber attack. Recent developments in the register space will open up opportunities for English speaking Canadians to obtain ISNIs in 2025. With this, we've reached the end of this section of the presentation. Stay here, as what's to follow is an insightful conversation between Lauren Stewart and BookNet's standard expert bibliographic manager Tom Richardson, where they ponder on the bigger questions and try to predict what will be next in 2025. And remember, the best way to stay up to date about all things standards is to subscribe to eNews, our weekly newsletter. Over to you, Tom and Lauren.
Hello, Tom. I get the luxury of being able to talk with you virtually every weekday I'd like to about standards issues whenever they come up. And I know that many people in our audience don't actually have that same privilege and would love to. So that's why we thought we would do this a little bit differently this year. And for those who are watching today, we thought we'd grab a little bit of your time to talk about the last year in standards and capture some of your thoughts. Um, it has been a wild year. We've seen a few new ONIX releases, some major codelist releases, a new edition of BISAC, as well as a large new release of Thema. And all of this has been occurring in a changing trade environment that has been causing a lot of concern. In the past year, many people at BookNet, including yourself, have found themselves burgeoning experts in a number of the newly introduced pieces of European legislation, which we'll get into today, and also looking at tariffs in a new way amid these emerging concerns about trade between the US and Canada. With all of that whirling around us in the present as well as in the past year, I do have a number of questions for you today, and I think we should just get started. And are you ready to get into some standards talk?
Well, I do think we're officially in interesting times.
Yes, that might be the theme of today. And I think to kick us off, I think the simplest way is to have you walk us through the release of ONIX 3.1.2 in November of last year. Um, and so the reason I started with this is I'm wondering if you could explain to our audience why it's important to stay on top of regular ONIX releases, and particularly why this one, this 3.1.2 release matters. Because I imagine that for many ONIX implementers in Canada, it may seem like the transition to 3.0 is still quite fresh in their minds.
That's terrifying in its way, just in the sense of it being around for so long. But um, I think it's important to go back to the introduction of 3.1 in 2003. And I just want to take the opportunity to say that I'm pleased to say that most of BiblioShare's Canadian source files in version 3 meet that revised standard. And that's a big kudo to us all, and well done on that. So that there were some real changes to ONIX at that point. Now, since then, ONIX has actually released 2 more version updates. So it's hard not to go through like the basics, but just to be clear, ONIX is always changing. 4 or 5 times a year, EDItEUR updates the ONIX code lists, adding new codes to existing lists in what's called issue updates. The important thing here is your software vendor should be providing you access to these new codes, and retailers should be accepting them. Continuous minor change. You got to plan for it, you got to accept it. It's just there. Now, version changes are when the structure of ONIX is changed to support new functionality through new tags, new code lists, and new composites. And there's been 11 of them since 2010. While we should expect major changes every couple of years, EDItEUR will make mini version updates to add immediately needed functionality. And that's what these two represented, being added in the spring and fall of 2024. And they added support to things needed by new European regulations. So 3.1.1 added an AI-related opt-out for marketing material in ONIX. And 3.1.2 added the ability to add a mailing address and needed to meet contact requirements in the EU for accessibility and safety metadata. It's not that difficult. There's nothing that much going on there, but people seem to be confused by version changes, particularly when they think they need to implement them, and they may then discover that this new thing is embedded in the larger section that they may not have implemented. So 3.1.2's addition was to product content, which appears in block 4 publishing, so you probably do have that support for it there, and in 2 places in block 6, product supply, to support either a publisher market contact or supplier contact. And you may or may not support that product contact information there. So who knows? So the EU request is to have an EU-based contact available. So I would expect it to be delivered in the EU market-specific section and not part of the publishing detail. It doesn't really make sense to stick it in the middle of your publishing detail to suddenly have an EU contact there where you have to have somebody named in the EU. I mean, I don't know. Put it in the market section for the EU and it makes perfect sense. So I really do think that the market publishing detail product contact is the most likely the right place to be. But if your distributor is handling it for you, then maybe it should belong in the supplier section, supply detail. I don't know. So really the first question is, are you creating this section in the ONIX or are they? So you may need to do nothing. That's usually what I have found out. Most Canadian publishers can rely on the European contacts to add this piece of information, and they don't actually have to add anything. My point is you're not responsible for implementing everything in ONIX, and the EU-based contact is best provided by an EU trading partner. However, regulators are likely to hold your business responsible for supporting their regulations. And that might be in ONIX or not. And that's something we can touch on later. I think that's kind of the most important thing. It's not what you need to do in ONIX is a simple question. What you need to support regulations is a complex question. So accessibility is settling in as a well-documented standard. We have the training in place, courtesy of Benetech and eBound. There are guidelines available through W3C and a number of other agencies as well. And the main issue is to simply make sure that the work done in creating accessible books has been made available both in the eBooks metadata and in the ONIX metadata so that retailers can display it in advance of purchase. I think you should expect regulators will want to find congruence between what's in the product, what the product can do, and what's in both types of metadata showing it. So regulation is like an outside compliance thing looking at all of that. So there's a couple of things that people should not forget that are worth mentioning on this. In addition to Europe's EAA deadline in June, the US deadline for Title II, their Accessibility Act, their deadline for compliance is upcoming a year from now, April 2026. Most authorities feel EU guidelines will work for Title II compliance. That's a question, but we think you're okay. But the US is just one of many jurisdictions that will have these sorts of requirements. EDItEUR has stressed the importance of code list 81 product content codes in addition to supporting the accessibility codes of list 196 used in product form feature. Now, the idea is simple, but seems to confuse people. Different components of books, what List 81 provides, can have implications for what accessibility support will be needed in the book. So this is like the master list for librarians and users alike to avoid surprises. If you're supporting alt text, then you should have List 81 components that need alt text. And contrawise, listing such components without coding for alt text is like a gigantic red flag. Regulators are expected to look for the red flags. So you should be using List 81, and it should help you organize your materials, and it should help make sure that you're providing accessibility properly, and it should also help regulators regulate. So a final good note, just kind of about the whole transition thing. Amazon has added ONIX 3 support for digital products and are expected to announce an actual cutoff of support for ONIX 2.1 sometime soonish, maybe the end of the year. It's not clear that they will set a deadline, but it has been their practice up to now. Also note for accessible books that Amazon has announced full support of accessibility metadata, as well as a plan to implement its display of it following the W3C guidelines. That's very much the best part. They are planning to support accessibility as we understand it should be supported.
Thanks, Tom. I'm definitely going to come back to that. And one thing that struck me as you were talking, there was I'm going to misquote you, but there was a line where you said that providing this information in ONIX is easier, and but actually following the legislations and being compliant is harder. And that beautifully matched a line from the Hamilton musical, where George Washington speaks to Alexander Hamilton and says, winning is easy, governing is harder. And I think that you kind of nailed it on the head there, that we feel quite confident that ONIX is ready to take on a lot of these challenges, thanks to the strong stewardship at EDItEUR. But actually, as a company, being prepared to robustly support the compliance and understanding why we're providing this metadata is a whole separate thing. And I think you've really laid that out quite clearly here, and I appreciate that. I think it's going to help a lot of people make its way through. But before we move on, I do want to loop back to that little piece you mentioned at the end there about Amazon, that they will start to accept ONIX 3.0 and 3.1 files for digital content as of March 21st of 2025. That was announced earlier in March and welcomed by many, as this could likely be the next major driver to get any holdouts still still sending data, I should say, using 2.1 moving over to 3. As much as I know you don't want to talk about this, but I think we have to, let's talk a bit about the transition from 2.1 to 3, and now this new 3.1. I know you've observed that transition to ONIX 3 has been stalled in Canada. Are you able to kind of talk us through that and what you envisage for the next 12 months?
Well, I think the most important thing that may have come up is that you may have just put the seeds for ONIX, the musical, out there. But okay, BISG, like under the very, very great tutelage of Claire Vate's Pat Payton, and with the support of BookNet Canada, should be releasing its best practices for North American metadata this year. This is a mammoth task. It has literally taken years to complete. It is a document firmly based on meeting ONIX standards as well as identifying industry needs, and its use will help solidify the transition to ONIX 3.0. So that is, probably the best news possible for overall things. And to be honest, I don't think the transition is stalled. I think that almost every Canadian publisher can supply version 3. And in terms of accepting it, Indigo, Book Manager, as well as major US retailers and wholesalers, and now Amazon are accepting it fully. I mean, now, so maybe it's worth talking about who the holdouts are. And they are the betwixt and between. Canadian distributors, mid-sized US companies who are not serviced by a major data aggregator, and of course, BookNet Canada's own BiblioShare is embarrassingly a holdout. These largely are companies that are accepting data from and delivering data to others. So you get caught by your success of what you've been doing, making it hard to change as everybody is already reliant on the old process on both sides. So it's really hard for these groups to make the transition. In the case of BiblioShare, we have made we have had some issues in our ability to load and process 3.0 in volume. And I can just say our decision to maintain ONIX as ONIX is a brilliant choice for our standards and a brutal one for our ability to smoothly make this transition. Twice the data processing is hard. That said, Catalyst has begun work with some accounts in 3.0, and BiblioShare has started serious work on an updated system. Stay tuned for more on that as the year progresses. So where are we? Amazon going fully 3 will be well served by the publishers who have largely made the transition, but I don't think it will solve the remaining transition problems. But you can see the time has come. Try to have sympathy for those who remain needing the older standard or spreadsheets. There are still some of those. But sympathy is time sensitive, and companies will make the business choices that they need to make. And that's going to drive the transition, and it's coming.
And that's a great validation for those of us, including us at BookNet, that have had to kind of manage these legacy 2.1 systems at the same time as supporting kind of a robust increase in volume as people move to 3.0. So necessitating this need to really transition sooner rather than later. I think that empathy piece that you're talking about is really fair. Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. And another thread I wanted to pick up on from before, and I'm sorry for not mentioning it earlier, is that European Accessibility Act, the EAA, and then this other acronym that we've talked about quite a bit the past year, which is the EUDR, which is also known as the European Union Deforestation Regulation. Both of these have become almost buzzwords over the last several months, and I think it's a good idea to go over these major pieces of legislation and how they may impact Canadian data senders and recipients in a bit more detail. You did kind of talk about that earlier. So tell me, in the words of Tom, what are the EAA and EUDR, and how does ONIX and bibliographic metadata play a part in compliance, since that's been part of the theme of your remarks so far?
Well, I'm still thinking about the ONIX, the musical, and how this might be integrated into that. Okay, there are actually 3 pieces of European legislation, and there are some really excellent webinars available as file from EDItEUR that should be consulted for full explanation. It's just there's the layers of this get run deep. The 3 that have to concern publishers are the new safety regulations, GPSR, EAA, the Accessibility or the European Accessibility Act, and EDItEUR, European Deforestation Regulations. The thing that ties these together is that they represent protection for European consumers. So if you want to sell products in Europe, they need to be safe. That's easy to understand. Consumers who need the support of accessible products should have it knowable and available. That's also easy to understand. And maybe a little more controversially, consumers should know that their products have not added to deforestation worldwide. And these regulations affect any product using wood, including books. Now, what's also shared here is there is a burden of proof involved and an expectation that book metadata is part of the solution. But they're 2 separate things. Generally, books are safe, assuming responsible manufacturing, and we have a good understanding of the metadata needs of accessible products. So it's mostly a matter of delivering that information. The regulation ensuring that products are sourced from sustainably harvested wood is harder to meet, and there is a registration of documents. The trick with this proof is, and this is shared by any of the regulations, is that every stage of the supply chain is responsible for the information they use. Due diligence is the byword, and it is expected and should be provable. Ultimately, the paper provider is responsible for the material that they manufacture paper from. But the publisher is responsible for their due diligence on all the paper in the book, the cover, the jacket, and paper stock, and they may all be uniquely sourced. Records must be kept. We can trace a piece of beef back to the animal on the farm. Similarly, we can track the wood back to the forest. Now, due diligence means that you need more than your word if a question comes up. The flashing light source or the improbable allergic reaction to a book may require specific information about its manufacturer, and the more detailed, the better. What if a consumer complains that the accessible book does not support the accessible features it's purported to have? There's a responsible contact, and resolution should be possible. What that looks like and how it's regulated is kind of an open question. For the deforestation to work, it means an audit has to be done. And if the chain has holes in it that can't be verified, then it may be that the product may not be sold in Europe. There are consequences to failing the audit. Now, the publisher has responsibility and can't just take the paper mill's word, nor can the paper mill take the forestry companies. And the retailer selling the book needs to be able to use the same diligence as the publisher has shown. Each is responsible, each is accountable. So, does ONIX need the full level of support, including supporting geocoding of source trees? I'm not 100% sure it's clear yet that all of that needs to be in the ONIX or not, but European forests, forestry, and manufacture can be argued to have an inside route to supply chain diligence in Europe. The documents at all parts of the chain are internal and are all registered within that European system. When you become a foreign publisher and a foreign manufacturer, you have to create and supply them on their own. Now, they're going to need that information for the first declaration of compliance that needs to be registered in the EU. And retailers need to be able to see that the geocoding is part of their due diligence. So maybe you need to include that, but if your European partners think not, then maybe the Canadian publisher should still expect to have it on file and should have shown good due diligence in confirming it to the best of their ability. It would be a shame to discover that the coding leads to a suspect source and you never bothered to check. Can I just say that there is no reason to assume bad faith on anyone's part, or that we even know what the audits will look like. The EU's goals are laudable. They do protect their consumers and help the planet. I think we should expect this sort of due diligence model to be supported by more jurisdictions and this type of record keeping a business requirement as we go forward.
I'm my tendency is to agree with you on that there, Tom. I do think this is going to be the new way forward with a lot of different jurisdictions. And I think you're absolutely right that rather than pushing back against some of these legislations, that we should see them as an indicator of what's to come, and also to appreciate that they are wholly reasonable asks of suppliers that are present in a market, and a market has the right to protect its consumers. I think that everything you've said here is absolutely accurate, and I promise to not ask you any more today about EU, about EU legislation, and we'll move away from that to one of my favorite areas of the last year and about the work that we do here at BookNet is to talk about subjects. Big deal last year was that there was a new version release for Thema in 2024, which is great because Thema just experienced its 10-year anniversary back in 2023. So a release in 2024 validates that we're still going strong. And in Canada, we have this unique situation because we have these dueling French and English markets that necessitate support of both Thema and BISAC. One of the things that you spoke to me about years ago was how you mentioned that you feel that Thema and BISAC actually work quite well together. And that is something that has stuck with me and I think is excellent guidance for anyone who is working with metadata or is working with subject coding. And I'm wondering if you could flesh that idea out a bit more about how you feel that BISAC and Thema work well together. Can you speak to any of these recent releases for either that can kind of give us some examples of this and walk us through these two standards?
Publishers don't want to spend money, and they've always had a desire to have like one standard, and it's natural to think that like one subject standard, and it's natural to think that it should be Thema. Certainly makes sense to us in Canada. But I think it's a simple fact that BISAC is not going to go anywhere. It is and will remain the dominant subject standard for the US market. And while BISAC is supportive, very supportive really of Canadian needs, the reason Canadian publishers need to support both is Thema is better for our market, and it's better for selling outside of our market. One of the reasons Thema is better for our market is that it's the standard that's actually shared between the French market and the Canadian or the English Canadian market. I don't know how best to describe those two. But the reason I stress that they work well together is they have different strengths. And I think the reason that the US seems to be planning to support Thema as well, and they certainly are talking about that, even if I don't know if there's been a lot of like real activity going forward on it, that if you're investing heavily in, say, something like keywords, which people love and somehow to have a real belief in, and you can't see the strength of a system like Thema, which is like basically providing you with a whole spectrum of concepts that link books together and qualifiers that link books together, and do provide it in a structured, predictable way that you could actually make a displayed subject system work well with. I mean, well, I don't know. I don't know what you're looking at. I mean, it is just self-evidently possible, but we do have a webinar done in 2023 with the UK bookseller who uses Thema and basically sort of says, it works really well and increases his sales. Go watch it. It's if we had him back again, he would only come back with even more information supporting it. The weakness in BISAC is that it provides a series of descriptive terms that make sense in the US market and to a degree in the Canadian market. If BISAC stuck to its strength, which would be segmenting the US market into saleable groupings of books and changing it all the time so that each year the coding changes, but you can, there's linkage of like what's selling well at any given time. I mean, and you're organizing some of your sales-based information on BISAC, you're singing at this point. You're doing really well. Thema, not so good here. Thema, good for websites, good for searching. Very organized means they're doing something. So it does something that keywords can't provide. Keywords are a pile of words that you can't link together. Maybe they give you search terms, and particularly for a university press, that allows you to like have a unique term that's only available for this one book. But Thema gives you the organized concepts. BISAC segments the market. They're just all doing different things, and they should be working to their strengths in each case.
Well, I think
So
we
I mean,
just heard your next TED Talk topic about what is a subject standard, what is a market segmentation tool. That is fascinating, and I appreciate what you're commenting there is, and what your comments there kind of speak to. But the one thing that I keep coming back to is how in Canada, our publishers, our distributors, anyone who is a data supplier, they're in a unique spot where they have to be at least familiar, if not skilled, in both of these systems in order to get their books to market. And that is because of these two operating French language and English language supply chains. And that and this kind of like speaks to this like larger thing in Canada about these two markets that exist, these two supply chains that exist. And traditionally it's been hard. It's been quite a challenge for publishers and distributors, retailers, all of these operating in, say, one market like the English market, to be able to break through and make inroads into the other language market, where of course there would be demand. There may be, predominantly French language books sold in French Canada, but of course there will be demand for English content that's produced elsewhere in the country. And so when we work with these two subject standards makes that really clear, like that how challenging this divide and these two supply chains operating actually are for ONIX implementers, for metadata experts, for anyone operating in these supply chains. So with this example of the subject systems, that French Canada exclusively supports Thema, and English Canada therefore must support Thema as well as BISAC to have unhindered access to both the southern North American market of the US, as well as gaining access to French markets and to French retailers and things like that. And so what is your take on this kind of dual state of multiple supply chains operating in Canada? Do you see any opportunities for any English market participants like retailers and libraries to access French Canadian books at this time?
okay, using the tariff thing where we've basically Canada has recognized that it has easier to trade for our individual provinces to trade to the US than it is to trade interprovincially, and that there is a real need to break things down. I mean, you can see this in the book industry where the dominant English language market exists, and then there's what amounted to a protected enclave in Quebec. Now, I think that we've seen the breaking down of that protective enclave already started. I mean, it starts in part because BookNet Canada has worked with BTLF more closely, and because now the BTLF is using the codelist sales tool internally in its market, which basically then means that the Quebec market is getting better access to English-speaking market, and guess what's happening? They're showing interest in getting their books out further. So, French distributors, which have serviced a protected market, are now basically going, maybe we can help there, and they seem to be showing interest in doing so. So you can already see the beginnings of like a breakdown of that. I mean, Indigo has long expressed an interest in selling French language books and language books in other type in other markets, and that requires, going back to metadata, good use of ONIX metadata. It potentially requires us using multi-language metadata, all of which is wonderfully supported in the ONIX standard if you just want to go looking into the deeper ends of it. And lots of stuff is possible if you want to start growing things. Thema is fabulous in part because it's translated into multiple languages, or 20, approaching 30, I think. And that's proper translation in most cases. And by proper translation means that they're translating concepts, not terms. So Thema makes sense in different markets. So we're increasingly getting tools that allow us to properly internationalize the industry. So all of this is basically setting up a scenario that could only do us good. I mean, there's no particular, I don't think the Quebec market wants to be protected in the sense that they don't want anything more than the survival of their culture. That's what they want. Their activity is not trying to prevent their book publishers from selling outside of it, or to prevent books being sold in Quebec, so long as the French language ones are the ones which, have the best access. So there's genuine interest in selling French language books in the English market. There's lots of educational opportunities, reasons to want better access to these books. Lots of reasons to want better access to all sorts of foreign language books. And we have people trying to work in them now. We have a metadata system that can work in that. We don't need to spend a lot of our time worrying about this anymore. That's my thinking. That, all the parts are just there. We just need to support them.
And you know what? I think that actually takes me kind of to my last question, which is how to contextualize the last year in standards, and really the last year in the book trade, and looking through not only the Canadian experience, the English Canadian, as well as the French Canadian experience. And I've been thinking about this quite a bit, especially as we're navigating this kind of uncertain trade environment, and how it feels like we're almost seeing through a glass darkly and navigating two different realities. Um, I see, in kind of what you have mentioned already, like I see international standards like ONIX, Thema, the W3C, ISNI, et cetera, as working towards supporting this idea of a more global marketplace for books, where international trade, as well as trade between English and French Canada, is robustly supported, and marketplaces around the world can kind of come together, build these trading solutions that work for all, and ideally remove friction and improve efficiency. And then the juxtaposition to that is this kind of emerging geopolitical landscape in many parts of the world that almost suggests an opposite, where some nations are effectively retreating into themselves, or where market and trade initiatives would suggest as such, like this kind of North American trade situation, tariff situation, being a prime example. And when I think of ONIX, when I think of Thema, so these standards run by EDItEUR and supported by BookNet, I feel very confident that our industry has the ability to navigate these storms, and that I see this output of organizations like EDItEUR as proof that a transnational initiative can succeed despite this kind of gloomy geopolitical landscape. And that's kind of my feeling of optimism despite everything that I've listed and everything I've shared. But what are your thoughts when you think about the year that has just passed? Where are you when you think about standards in 2025?
I've been very impressed by the way our industry has collectively stood up to support the free exchange of ideas, as well as maintaining books as a protected cultural product. And I think both concepts are important to be maintained. I mean, free access, but we understand that culture has needs and value outside of commerce. I mean, we try to avoid othering, I don't know, enclaves. I don't know, I'm just trying to find a completely neutral word. So we don't want to other enclaves, prevent them from existing. We want to value small ventures, and we want to foster unique voices, all of which, like, books are really good at. The small market is the big market for books. We at least try in the industry, even if we don't always succeed in not being dicks. The U.S. Publishing Association is also trying not to be. They have done huge work in, protecting the banning of books and doing all sorts of things. And we have all the same problems occurring in Canada. So I just hope that we continue to work with and sell foreign publishers, because Canada would be less without them. That's my just overall look on all these things. And I think that's what EDItEUR represents. That's what the exchange of metadata represents. I mean, the description of products allows, like, the books to have a freedom that they allows you to find the small stuff, if you want to look at it that way.
Well, I think that this kind of comes back to market-based metadata. And I know you've thought about this a lot in your career, and this has been something that you've robustly supported, the idea that unique markets exist. And maybe this is an opportunity to kind of speak to that, and maybe we can loop back to that.
I always have to take every opportunity to emphasize the importance of using any metadata standard to communicate as fully as possible. And that, unfortunately, because, well, I mean, what a market is a market is basically a place where is an identifiable place where a business has to work in a shared way, right? That's what it is. Tax laws are the same. Your sales force will be shared. Some sort of aspect is being shared. That's what a market represents. So to communicate fully means you need to communicate to markets. So, I mean, not everything needs to be said, because we talked about that, but whatever you do say in metadata needs to be said fully. If you're relying, say, on retailers to assume aspects of what you're trying to say about a market or something like that, which is a common place to make assumptions, what you're actually doing is creating, like, say, sending them a feed that represents the market. You're actually creating an ambiguity that's a drag on the book supply chain. You're not claiming the market. You're letting the retailer assume that you have it. And that allows other companies to do the same, because retailers will get confused because you're not giving them metadata that claims the market. You're giving them a feed and feeds go wrong. They go wrong a lot. That's something that we know in BiblioShare. So it's not an exaggeration to say your company is losing revenue and making retailers spend more than they have to. So it's so much, using again, like all the other lessons we're trying to put together again, it is so much simpler to follow ONIX guidelines. Treat its sales rights composite as territorial expressions of the contracts the publisher has signed for this ISBN. And then to assign a subset of those contracts that represents the distribution of representation within a market, which is something a publisher does. They assign rights to markets to a fully realized Block 6 product supply that comes complete with a territory, the business terms, the dates, the status, everything that's relevant to supplying that market. You can include the publisher's reps, you can include the distribution, you can include the wholesalers if you want to. You can include the drop shippers if you want to. You can describe a market in a single business-friendly unit. It's called Block 6. Anyway, and creating and processing full ONIX records requires full support of Block 6. And that is the first step to exporting block updates, which is the first step in realizing that you don't have to send full ONIX records all the time, which is expensive and time consuming and an effort. It's the waste of effort in processing and everything else. Anybody who looks at it can see that. So block updates can save you time and effort, particularly for supporting foreign-based products. We're circling around yet again. Particularly for foreign-based products, as well as for your selling books outside of Canada. In either case, you just replace the Block 6 that you are now set up to support with the information you expect that market sales force to sell with. It isn't harder than that. And why we are making it harder than that is completely beyond me. And maybe you do that by letting your sales force in that market add its information to your feed. There's actually not much difference between a sales rep spreadsheet and what should be in that market's Block 6. Do nothing, and support accuracy might become an option by simply adopting market-based metadata. Nothing's that simple. I mean, okay, there's some other things you have to do. I mean, Block 5's related products, the comp titles aren't going to be right unless you make them right for that market. Block 2, is the copy correct? Probably not. Not for every market. You just can't do it. Anyway, specific subject entries. Sorry, if you're going to sell in the US, you better have a BISAC in there, and it may not be available because BISAC is special to the US. Things happen. So Block 1 maybe have bits and pieces, but most of the ONIX record should be unchanged outside of Block 6. And advanced ONIX offers some solutions to some of these tweaks, and there's literally no point in considering them unless you can handle market-specific metadata. So many Canadian publishers are already there now, but our distributors, aggregators, and foreign metadata sources just are not. Wait a minute. Isn't that the list of betwixt and between? It is, actually. Anyway, save time, save money, make wherever fine books are sold mean something for your business.
Thank you, Tom. I think that wraps everything up perfectly. And we can send people away with that. Make wherever fine books are sold mean something for your business. And I think that's a reasonable ask and a reasonable expectation for our industry.
And it's a reasonable part of ONIX the musical too.
Thank you. Full circle. You've been so good at coming back to everything throughout. So let's just wrap up today that if you are interested in following things about standards, about things going on at BookNet and the other things that we do, you can sign up at booknetcanada.ca/newsletter-sign-up. You can also catch up on other Tech Forum sessions at bnctechforum.ca. And you can also reach the standards team at BookNet directly at standards@booknetcanada.ca. Please reach out there. We love hearing from you. And thank you for your time today. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. It's been fun.